The events of 2020, supply chain interruptions, shortages of medical supplies, have shown us how vulnerable we are if we can't rely on domestic manufacturing to provide what we need. The result is a greater awareness of the value of reshoring. But in an important sense, reshoring has to begin with tool and die work. I'm Peter Zelinski with Modern Machine Shop Magazine. We're going to have a brief conversation that explores the importance of our domestic tool and die capacity. Joining me in the discussion, let me introduce our panelists. Don Dumoulin is CEO of Precise Tooling Soutions, an Indiana maker of injection molds, and that means tooling to make plastic parts. Bill Berry is president of Dytech and Engineering, a Michigan company that also makes injection molds, but to a greater extent makes die-cast tooling, and that means tooling for making metal parts. Harry Mosier is founder of the Reshoring Initiative, a nonprofit that works toward bringing manufacturing work back to the U.S. And Steve Kline is Chief Data Officer for Gardner Intelligence, a research and market intelligence group focused on manufacturing. I'd like to direct the first question to Don Dumoulin of Precise Tooling. Help people outside of manufacturing understand the term. When we say tool and die, when we say die mold, in general terms, what do we mean by this? What do we mean by tooling?
Well, when I think of tooling, I think of hardworking American craftsmen that are using the latest technology to build tools that build something else. In our case, at Precise Tooling Solutions, we build plastic injection molds that are then used by a wide variety of customers to build interiors of cars or front-end lighting or even flower pots. But they're early tools that are then used to build a later product.
So Bill Berry, just like Don's company, your company manufactures tooling. The challenge is we've seen tooling work sent overseas in search of lower cost, particularly sent to China. When did that begin and why?
You know, it's very difficult for me to identify exactly where and when that began, but I was an international service personnel for General Motors in the late 80s, and the automotive companies started exploring producing their products overseas, and they were exposed to dramatic savings in tooling that low-cost countries could provide, and I think short-sightedly, they felt that there were nothing was given away by just buying that low-cost tooling and foregoing all of the knowledge that is built into the tool when you work closely with a tooling supplier. So,
Bill said short-sightedly, kind of referring to lost knowledge. I think we're going to explore that a little more, and as we get into this, Harry Mosier. Yeah, we're going to explore the economics of this as well, and you help educate people about that. From a higher level view, just as a starting point, from your perspective, how's the manufacturer who buys and uses tooling potentially hurt by sending tooling work far away? How's the nation as a whole hurt by that as well if our tool and die capacity declines?
I'd start by building on what Bill said, that when the tooling is done offshore, a different language, a different time zone, not meeting face-to-face, the partnership between the tooling buyer and the tooling producer is largely reduced. And it's critical to be able to optimize the product and the process in parallel rather than having them so far separated. To me, that's essential, but also delivery. If it's a big, heavy tool, it's either very long to ship by boat, or there's air freight, Trump tariffs if they apply, intellectual property risk. All these things can be substantial in terms of the manufacturer. In terms of the nation, the trade deficit, the budget deficit, military preparedness, all these things are essential. If you don't have the tools, you don't have tools now to make the consumer product, you don't have the tools and tooling capacity to make the tanks. And finally, it's been said that tooling differentiates us from beasts And so if we don't make tooling, can't make tooling, I believe our society is in decline.
Steve Kline, can you give us a big picture that kind of fleshes that out? So tool and die, it's a relatively small sector, but it controls much larger sectors. So molded plastic parts need tooling, die cast parts need tooling, stamped parts need tooling. Can you give us a sense of this? What's the size of the U.S. tool and die market? And by comparison, what is the size of injection molding, die casting, and stamping?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start with that is production of dies and molds. And since 2011, just after the great financial crisis, Great Recession, the die mold market, production-wise in the U.S., has been about $6 billion on average. Now, that production figure does not include dies and molds produced in-house by OEMs. So we're really only talking about dies and molds produced by companies like Bills and Don's. And then we want to add into that imports and exports, and we can see that since 1989, imports have been on a steady increase into the U.S. of dies and molds, while exports have remained relatively the same. And if we add imports to production and subtract out exports, we get consumption of dies and molds in the U.S. And for the last 3 years, we've been right around $8 billion, which is an all-time high for die and mold consumption in the United States. But to your point, Pete, if we put that into context of where dies and molds are used, if we look at custom processors, which are essentially contract injection molders, those companies ship about $100 billion of plastic parts in a year. So 10 times or a little more than 10 times the size of the die mold market. And if we ended up looking at dies and jigs and fixtures, which is another component of this to some extent for metal parts, we would see very similar numbers. So when we're using dies and molds and tools, we're producing something that is about 10% of the market that they're being used in.
In addition to the tooling that's imported that Steve described, there's a lot of tooling whose function is imported because we import the products, the plastic products, the metal products, what have you, that are produced offshore. And in those cases, the tooling is almost always made offshore to produce those products. So if you look at our trade deficit in those finished goods, there's probably another 30% or 40% of tooling that we would have made here if we produced all those products instead of importing those products.
Don, why is tooling expensive? Say that word to the average person and they think of a hammer or a screwdriver. So your company's molds are tools in the same way, but they're much more specialized, much more sophisticated. You mentioned at the beginning the craftsman and the technological sophistication that goes into making your tooling. Elaborate on that. What goes into making an injection mold for a plastic part?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Our plastic injection molds are really complicated projects. They typically sell for somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000. They'll weigh somewhere between 4 and 6 tons. And we'll have some 2,000 hours of design and then manufacturing that goes into build each one of them. So they're very high caliber steel, very complicated movements in it. And if you think about any plastic part that you see in your car or in your daily life, and you try to imagine that coming out of of 2 big blocks of steel, if you will, what you've got is you've got a situation that you've got a lot of moving parts, because when that mold pulls apart, there are slides and lifters and all those kinds of things that help release that part. So these are really complicated designs, and they take really skilled craftsmen to build these.
Harry Mosier, would you react to that? Don described why the cost of tooling is high. When manufacturers seek a lower price for their tooling from an overseas supplier, is that price really a savings? How should we think about cost?
Well, it can be a savings. It probably was a savings 20 years ago when Chinese labor was so low. But The main issue is, though, that the companies look only at that price or at the wage rate, and they don't look at we call the total cost of ownership. And when you add in all the other factors, duty, freight, carrying cost of inventory, quality differences, et cetera, you get an entirely different picture. So as you can see from this chart, we've displayed a Chinese price as a percentage of U.S. price, done on hundreds of samples of different products. And you can see that the blue line shows the price as a percentage of U.S. The red line shows total cost as a percentage of U.S. and the yellow line is total cost with a 15% Trump tariff. You can see how the curve shifts to the right. What counts is how much is beyond the 100% point, because then the U.S. wins. And now in the second chart, you can see how when the companies look only at price, the U.S. wins 8% of the time. When they look at total cost, we win 32% of the time. And when they look at total cost with a Trump tariff, 46% of the time. So by doing the math correctly, by looking at all those relevant factors, all of a sudden the U.S. is in much stronger position. So I mentioned the total cost of ownership estimator. That's free to use on our website, www.reshorenow.org. So again, free to use. You just sign up, you sign in, you use it. You can call me for help, email for me for help. When you do that, you're making us very happy. And second, we have a special program called the Import Substitution Program, where we can identify the biggest importers of the things that your company makes. And so if you're interested in that, we can help you find some excellent new markets. And when you sell to them, you'll be reshoring, you'll be helping them reshore.
The question was, is that price really a savings? We've seen time and time again that our customers, or many customers, they don't really have a good handle on their total cost to produce parts. If you look at the line item for tooling costs, invariably the tooling cost would be higher if the tooling was acquired here. But many times we're able to supply with that tooling ideas and changes to the manufacturing processes that make the cost to produce the part much less in the United States. We had an example a few years ago of an office furniture manufacturer where we were able to generate about, almost the entire cost of an entire tooling program in operational savings by eliminating some assembly operations and some components in one of their products. And we could only do that because instead of just producing the tool they asked, we had knowledge of their operations and we were able to suggest changes to their design that reduce the cost to produce their part. When you go offshore to tooling, you send out a print. There's language barriers. The company that's quoting probably knows nothing of your operations, and he gives you the price. He gives you the price that you asked for. He doesn't give you ideas that might improve your operational efficiencies. So, I think that's something that the entire cost accounting system in the United States in manufacturing doesn't do a good job of understanding.
Bill, you're talking about advantages of being within the same country as the buyer of the tool, the cost advantages of that, but I believe there are other advantages as well of just being close to the customer, being in the same region, and an easy place to interact and communicate with them. And could you elaborate on the benefits that come from that?
Sure. I can think of a number of them, but some very important ones. Companies will go out and purchase multiple sets of tooling because it's a critical part. It needs to be produced all the time. If something would happen to that tool, they need to be able to produce parts right away. And often if you're geographically close, you can mitigate the need or reduce the need to buy that second set of tools because you're going to be there to support it. If that tool needs to be, a major repair or a refurbishment or whatever needs to be done, and it was produced overseas, well then oftentimes they're going and they're buying second sets of tools. We had a very interesting event a number of years ago. One of our customers had a plant fire, and we had built the vast majority of tooling for that entire factory. Our trucks were at their facility before they called because we saw the fire on the news, and before GM, Ford, and Chrysler had sent their response teams, we had already, helped formulate a disaster recovery plan, and we were repairing the tools in the order they were going to be needed. Instead of the tools being shipped to different customers all over the country or different suppliers all over the country to help them respond, we were able to help this customer for their customers make it like it never happened. So, that's something you simply can't do if you're not closely coupled with them, and if you don't value that relationship and have those capabilities, so those are just a few of the things that I can think of.
Steve Kline, this year we saw supply chain disruptions, international breakdowns in manufacturing shipments between countries. What perspective can you offer on the way that affected tooling?
Well, we already looked at data on imports of dies and molds, and we've seen that they've been increasing since 1989. And we can break that down and look at the top 5 countries that the U.S. is importing molds from. And those top 5 countries since the mid-90s have accounted for roughly 80% of the molds that we're importing. So most of our mold imports are coming from a handful of countries. And in most cases, most years, they're coming from 2 countries. Back in 1996, Canada and Japan accounted for almost 80% of the U.S. mold imports. And in 2019, the top 2 countries were Canada and China, but the top 2 only accounted for about 63% of the imports. And if we looked at monthly data of mold imports, we would see that only China decreased in the first part of 2020. So we only decreased our mold imports from China in the first quarter of this year. Of course, the Chinese economy was the first hit by the pandemic. And the real question is what is that is that trend going to continue long term, or is this just a short term thing? And I tend to believe that given the animosity that continues to grow during the pandemic between China and the US, and Americans that aren't in manufacturing understanding more the importance of manufacturing, I think that trend is going to continue.
Let's talk about one solution that's already been advanced. We heard Harry Mosier mention it in discussing his figures. A step that was taken before the pandemic. That step was tariffs on mold tooling sold into the US from China. Bill, do tariffs help, and are tariffs the right answer?
Tariffs definitely help. Are they the right answer? There's probably many ways that you could do a better job, and perhaps it's providing some kind of other avenue of support to your tooling industry. But as a former international service personnel for a big 3 automaker, those tools that are being built overseas are heavily subsidized. I mean, we've seen it from some of our customers when we were asked to build tooling here, and we needed specialty equipment that was very expensive, and we didn't really have the ability to purchase it because of long-term forecasts or whatever. Our Chinese competition was essentially provided that equipment somehow. It certainly wasn't through a normal financial calculation. They were told, well, if you'd like us to buy tooling from you, you need this kind of equipment, and magically that kind of equipment appeared. So whether tariffs are the correct way to do it or not, that's a very difficult question, but we know that they help level the playing field when it's not level. So I guess they're okay.
Don, same question. What can you add to that? Do tariffs help? Why should tool and die businesses be protected this way?
Well, I think tariffs absolutely help. They certainly level the playing field, and just look at the simple economics of it. Let's take the $100,000 plastic injection mold that I referred to earlier. That mold would probably sell for $60,000 if it came from China. You add the tariff of 25% that President Trump put in place. That brings the price up to $75,000. You then also add $15,000 in shipping. Now the customer's looking at a $90,000 mold against a $100,000 mold in the United States, and they're going to choose an American-made mold every time. So I think it is a protectionary strategy, but one that works very good for American industry.
I think the biggest point, and Harry mentioned it earlier in the total cost of ownership, that gets us most of the way there, and tariffs add very little bit. So I think if we really understand Harry's point about total cost of ownership, and then on top of that, the strategic importance long-term of manufacturing in the U.S., that would probably make tariffs unnecessary.
Can I speak? Can I interject
Please.
just a little bit? The tariff, I would tend to agree that, in general, the tariffs are probably not the right way to do many things. You just don't want to pick and choose your winners and losers. In tooling, we've got a very interesting situation. If when the tooling for a project for a General Motors, Ford, or Chrysler, or office furniture manufacturing is manufactured overseas, the way tooling is purchased here, the savings for that tooling goes to the OEM, goes to the GM, Ford, or Chrysler. The cost for using that tooling usually goes to the producer of the parts that supplies that OEM. So the OEM is trying to save capital on their new vehicle acquisition, and they're pushing the cost or the inefficiencies of either poor quality tooling or the lack of intellectual coupling to the manufacturer. They're pushing that down on their entire supply chain.
Another thing to consider in all of this, when we're talking about total cost of ownership and shifts in manufacturing around the world, it's really easy for the American public and the media at large to focus on those shifts of manufacturing as it relates to the producers of our end products, very large companies. We've been talking a lot about automotive companies, Ford, GM, and those sorts of companies. And what gets lost in some of this is that the die mold producers tend to be very small businesses. In many cases, family businesses with 30 to 50 employees. And so there's a dramatic difference in effect of when interest rates are changing and those large companies are shifting manufacturing overseas and saving some on profit, it's dramatically hurting businesses that can't do that and can't take advantage of that.
Steve mentioned the strategic importance of tooling, long-term importance, and potentially a cost there that might be difficult to quantify. What I'm referring to is intellectual property. Don, I'd like you to speak to that. When you make the tooling, you also know a lot about your customer's product design, and you know how that customer is going to manufacture their product because you're making the tooling that does that manufacturing. Is all of that a consideration worth thinking about? Is an inventor's idea safer if the tooling is made nearby?
Well, I think absolutely it is. The importance of protecting IP for our customers is usually paramount. And it's never made any sense to me why you would develop a product and spend millions of dollars developing that product to send it to China. And I just don't understand why manufacturers would take that risk of letting their own intellectual property be built in some other country. We've got plenty of capacity here in the United States. We've got the best craftsmen around the world, and it should be paramount to them to protect that by using American workers.
Bill Barry, to close, you have a powerful success story to tell about domestic toolmaking capability and the role it played in the pandemic. Your company, Ditech and Engineering, was asked to make the die rapidly for some badly needed ventilator components. The die was supposed to take 5 weeks to build. It was delivered in 5 days instead. How were you able to do that?
That was one of the most exciting projects we ever had the opportunity to work on. Exactly how it happened would be, I think March 19th, my wife and I were watching an NBC special on the pandemic. And, I commented to her, and we commented because they were talking about how long it would take to make some of these parts to ramp up production. I commented that it would be interesting if we could somehow get involved because they're not really capable of understanding what is possible. And by some magic turn of events, Friday, the next day, I got an RFQ for a group of ventilator parts from one of my customers who was very familiar that we were fast. It was a RFQ that was sent out to a number of suppliers because they really thought they needed all these parts fast, and they were going to have to spread the work out. We were able to identify that this was something that was personally important to us, important to the country, and that we wanted to be involved in, and we responded by telling them that it could be done faster than they really understood. We promised that we would do it in an incredibly fast time frame. I held my engineering team over Friday night. We called our supply chain and we told them we needed to hold their employees over because we were going to need steel and components through the weekend and during the night. Steel started showing up here 2 a.m. on Saturday morning. Our heat treat supplier held their furnaces for us to heat treat the steel on Sunday. We cleared out all of the equipment that we had in the facility that was needed for these parts Monday morning, and we had 15 machines working on the first most important ventilator component. And by Wednesday at noon, we were loading that die on the truck. And that was a die that if you typically went out for industry, you'd get quotes from 8 to 10 weeks to design and build something like this. But by having a company, and we're not the only company, but having a company in your country, or that can do this sort of thing, we were able to deliver this die in 4.5 days. There's just no way that on any normal commercial acquisition thing you would be getting it in any less than 5, 6, 8 weeks, especially if you went offshore. So that was a very, very for us a very wonderful opportunity to contribute, and there were a number of other tools that went along with the program. General Motors became involved in acquiring some of these tools, and the government wasn't good at making decisions. And we actually started producing those tools without orders after getting agreements from our suppliers that they would just eat the cost. And we ended up delivering 7 tools in 3 weeks. And I think by 4 weeks there were patients in the hospital using ventilators with components that we built. So it was very exciting. But it could only be done with a national presence of tooling manufacturers.
So what does that success say or illustrate about the need for tool and die making capacity in the U.S.?
Whether you're looking at a natural disaster, whether you're looking at a change in markets, whether you're looking at a defense issue, tooling's the first thing that you're required to acquire for all of those things. If there's a natural disaster like a pandemic, you have to respond quickly. You need tooling. If there's a change in markets, say We're going to buy electric cars now instead of internal combustion cars. Well, you need to acquire tooling. If, God forbid, there's a defense issue, if you want to retool to make airplanes like they did in World War II, you need tooling. And all of those things are the first part of manufacturing. And I think if you give up your tooling base, I think tooling is the seed for manufacturing. You're really challenged because you can't reinvent your tooling industry nearly as quickly as the tooling industry can help you reinvent your manufacturing industry.
Bill makes a really good point here about the importance of tooling from an economic perspective. If we thought about a really simple example, I can dig a hole so fast with my hands. Give me a tool, a shovel, I can dig that hole a lot faster, a lot better. Give me a backhoe and it can go a whole lot faster. And that increase in productivity from tools is what drives economic growth. It's what makes us wealthier, what makes us richer, and what allows us to consume more products and have more leisure time. Tools are at the start of that. You basically can't have economic growth without the ability to make tools. And tools are at the very beginning of all of that in the economic engine. And as Bill mentioned, if building tools takes time, and the expertise to build tools, there's a lot of knowledge in that doesn't just come overnight. And so you have to maintain that ability to make tools to sustain long-term growth in the economy.
Maintaining that ability to make tools. We'll end it there. I want to say thank you to our panelists for joining me in this important discussion. I'm Peter Zelinski with Modern Machine Shop Magazine.